Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Her pregnancy was never meant to happen. At least, not in the way it did. The villagers whispered before they screamed, and they screamed before they dared to look her in the eyes. She was only a girl, but when her body began to swell, every shadow in the town seemed to point toward her house. They said the baby growing inside her was not just her child, but her curse, a creation that should never have been born. And when the truth of the father slipped from hushed lips, a collective sickness swept through the village like a plague. This is not just another story of forbidden love or reckless sin. This is a story so deeply tangled in bloodlines that it blurs the line between family and prison. The kind of truth that rots in the soil long after the bodies are gone. Generations of secrets concealed in plain sight, carried forward by daughters who never had a choice. By mothers who raised their own sisters, by fathers who gave life to their own grandchildren, and now by a girl whose womb became the final stage of a family's collapse. You see, when you walk through rural America, you pass houses that keep their windows shut, even when the air outside is sweltering. You pass barns that lean with age but never fall, as though they too are forced to carry a weight they cannot drop. Behind those walls, in families the world forgot, stories like this are not rare. They are just unspoken. She was called the daughter. That's all anyone dared to say aloud. Not her name, not her laughter, not the day she first bled and the women in the Inbred house looked away, already knowing what it meant. She belonged not to herself but to the cycle, and when the cycle turned its eye toward her, she could not resist. What happens when bloodlines tighten until they strangle? What happens when the very people who are meant to protect a child become the ones who consume her? Her pregnancy shocked the village not because it was sudden, but because it was inevitable. They had watched the walls close in for years, and yet when her belly began to swell, they acted as though it were the first sign of sickness, rather than the final symptom of a disease that had been eating her family alive for generations. The daughter carried more than a child. She carried the living evidence of her family's darkest covenant. And in her silence, in her trembling body, the entire village was forced to confront what they had pretended not to see. The first time anyone dared to question her, it was in the churchyard. An old woman, face wrapped in black cloth, leaned close and asked in a voice almost kind, "Who did this to you?" The daughter did not answer. She stared past the woman, past the crooked tombstones, past the gnarled oak that had seen more burials than blessings. Silence was her only defense, but silence was also her confession, because in that village, everyone already knew. The bloodline was not new to scandal. Decades earlier, her grandmother had given birth to children whose faces carried a strange symmetry, almost too similar to be natural. Some of the boys had walked with uneven steps, their jaws too weak, their words tangled. Yet no one spoke of it aloud. They told themselves it was just bad luck, the misfortune of living hard lives in a forgotten corner of the country. But those who looked closer, those who dared to connect the faces, saw the truth. Each child was less a branch of a family tree and more a loop in a noose, tightening with every generation. The daughter had grown up inside that loop. She had learned that her uncles were also her cousins, that her father's face was too similar to her brother's, that the men in her family carried the same deep-set eyes, the same crooked teeth, the same short tempers that turned gentle one moment and terrifying the next. In the house where she was raised, words like uncle and brother and father blurred together until they no longer carried meaning. By the time she was 12, she understood the unspoken law. Her body did not belong to her. It belonged to the bloodline. When the child inside her began to grow, it was not an accident. It was the fulfillment of something planted in her long before she had a name for it. The village reacted with a mix of disgust and denial. Some whispered prayers for her, convinced she was a victim of sin. Ot. Hers cursed her outright, as though she had invited the corruption herself. But the cruelest voices were not from strangers. They came from within her own family, insisting that nothing wrong had happened, that this was how things were meant to be. They wanted her quiet. They wanted the world to believe that nothing unnatural had occurred. But her body betrayed them. Every month her belly swelled further, every step grew heavier, until her secret could no longer be hidden. The church could not cleanse it. The neighbors could not ignore it. Her pregnancy became a living, breathing monument to the bloodline's darkest truth, a truth carved into her flesh, impossible to erase. When the child finally came, it was not greeted with joy, but with a silence so heavy it seemed to choke the room. The birth happened in the middle of the night, behind a door that had been locked from the inside. No doctor, no midwife, only the older women of the family, their faces set in stone, their eyes refusing to meet one another. They had done this before, too many times. And yet, when the baby's first cry echoed through the walls, even they flinched. The daughter lay trembling, her young body broken open, her eyes glassy from the hours of pain. She did not look at the child. She couldn't. The blood, the cries, the whispers around her blurred into something unreal, as though she were floating outside her own body, watching a scene she could not escape. The women cleaned the infant, but their hands shook. They whispered that the child's face carried too much resemblance to its father, who was also its uncle, its grandfather, its brother in blood, if not in name. Word traveled fast. By dawn the village knew. Some said the child should not be allowed to live. Others said the daughter should be hidden away forever. A few, in their twisted sense of loyalty, insisted the family should protect her, keep her close, and silence anyone who dared to ask questions. The entire community became complicit in her shame, caught between revulsion and fascination. For the daughter, motherhood was not a blessing, it was a sentence. Every time she looked at the infant, she saw not just a child, but the living face of the man who had taken her innocence. A child who would grow up carrying the same blood that had imprisoned her, the same tangled lineage that had destroyed every woman before her. She wanted to love it, to cradle it the way a mother should. But each touch felt like betrayal. Each breath the baby took was a reminder that her body had been turned into a weapon against herself. And yet, the village could not look away. They watched her walk, frail and hollow-eyed, with the baby strapped to her chest. They gossiped at the well. They whispered in the church pews, but none dared to confront her, because to confront her meant confronting themselves. They had seen the signs. They had ignored the warnings, and now the evidence was here, squirming in her arms, a small and fragile curse that would grow before their very eyes. The daughter did not speak of the father. She didn't need to. His shadow lingered in every crooked smile, in every whispered conversation, in every child born with features too familiar to be coincidence. Her silence screamed louder than words. The years that followed were not kind. The daughter, still little more than a child herself, was forced to raise her baby under the same roof where her own life had been stolen. The walls of that house, sagging with age, seemed to lean closer with every season, as though they too were heavy with the weight of secrets. Outside, the field stretched wide and empty, but inside she was a prisoner. The family kept her close, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of what she might say, fear of what the world might see if she ever escaped. The child grew quickly, but not normally. Villagers whispered about the way it stumbled when it should have walked straight, about the eyes that never seemed to focus, about the strange way its face carried echoes of too many relatives at once. Each feature told a story the family wanted to bury. The resemblance was undeniable, and with each passing year, the shame became harder to disguise. The daughter withered in silence. She rarely spoke, her voice dulled to a monotone, her eyes hollow. Some said she was cursed, that she carried a demon within her for what she had done, but others, those who dared to look deeper, saw that she was not cursed by choice, but by blood. Her silence was not guilt, but survival. To speak the truth would mean exile, or worse. And so she endured, bearing her suffering like a martyr chained to the altar of her family's making. But the village could not escape her shadow. Every Sunday when she entered the church, heads turned, whispers rippled like wind through dry grass. Children pointed, mothers pulled them close, men shook their heads but kept their eyes fixed on her. She was no longer just a girl or even a mother. She had become a symbol, a reminder that what had been buried beneath generations of denial could no longer be contained. There were nights when the daughter stood at the edge of the well, staring into the black water, her baby asleep inside. She thought of dropping stones, of watching the ripples disappear. She wondered if the water would erase her name, her face, her bloodline. But she never jumped. She never let go. Perhaps she was too afraid. Perhaps she believed the curse would follow her even into death. Or perhaps, deep inside, she carried a defiance that no one could see, a refusal to let the bloodline's darkness claim the last of her will. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? As the child grew, the lines of the bloodline became impossible to ignore. Its speech came late, its words slurred, its movements were stiff, awkward, almost painful to watch. The villagers whispered of a mark, an invisible brand that revealed itself in the children of such unions. They called it weakness. They called it madness. They called it a punishment from God. But the truth was simpler and far more horrifying. It was the body itself rebelling against what had been forced upon it. The daughter tried to protect the child, though she could not protect herself. She shielded it from the stares, the cruel laughter, the pointed fingers of other children. But inside, she feared what everyone else already knew, that she had not given birth to a future, but to a continuation of the past, a living echo of the cycle she had been trapped inside since birth. The men of the family carried on as though nothing had happened. They worked the fields, drank themselves quiet at night, and looked at her only when they needed something. To them, the daughter was less a person and more a resource, a body, a vessel. Her suffering was invisible because it had always been invisible. Generations of women before her had carried the same silence, and no one had spoken on their behalf. Yet outside the house, the shame was spreading. Neighbors who once turned a blind eye now crossed the road to avoid her. Children were told not to play near her child. The church, once her only refuge, became another stage for humiliation. Sermons grew sharper. The words sin and blood spat from the pulpit with glances that cut like knives. The daughter sat in the pews with her head bowed, the child in her lap, and listened to her own damnation disguised as scripture. There was no escape, no one to save her. The family held her tighter, the village pushed her further away, and the child, her own flesh, became both her only companion and her greatest torment. She had not just inherited the curse of her bloodline, she had given it life. And so the years dragged on, each one heavier than the last. By the time she turned 20, she looked twice her age. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, her body worn thin from labor and grief. She was no longer seen as a victim, but as part of the disease itself, a reminder to everyone of what happens when silence festers too long, when families guard their shame instead of confronting it. By the time whispers reached beyond the village, the story had twisted into legend. Strangers passing through spoke of a girl who had carried her uncle's child, of a family so entangled in itself that no blood remained untainted. Some called her wicked, others pitied her, but none sought to help. She was reduced to a tale, a cautionary shadow told in hushed voices, stripped of her humanity. The daughter had become folklore, alive, yet already a ghost. The child, now old enough to wander, carried the burden too. Every glance in its direction was a reminder of the sin that had birthed it. Teachers avoided its eyes. Children mocked its gait. Even in innocence, the child was condemned, branded by a lineage it never asked for. The daughter saw this, and each day it carved her a little smaller inside. To protect the child meant reliving her own violation, but to turn away meant abandoning the only soul who shared her prison. She was trapped in a paradox, mother and victim, protector and prisoner. The house itself became unbearable. The air was thick with rot, not of wood, but of unspoken truths. The men drank deeper, their tempers sharper, their voices louder. Every slammed door, every heavy boot on the floor, carried the threat of history repeating itself. The daughter lived in constant fear, knowing that what had been done to her could be done again, if not to her, then to her child. The curse was not a story of the past. It was still unfolding, right there in the hollow rooms of that house. The villagers no longer pretended not to see. Their silence had once made them complicit, but now their judgment made them cruel. They mocked, they avoided, they whispered prayers for deliverance as though her very presence called down wrath upon them. Yet none asked the question that lingered like a stench over the fields: who was truly guilty? The daughter who carried the curse, or the men who had sown it into her bloodline? Her life was not lived. It was endured. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the growing realization that she was not the first, and she would not be the last. Her grandmother had lived it, her mother had lived it, and now she lived it too. Generations of daughters folded into the same story, their cries swallowed by the same silence. The curse was not just in the blood, it was in the silence that guarded it. In the end, the daughter's story was not written in ink, but in whispers that never found rest. Some say she grew old in that house, her face hardening into the same silence as the women before her. Others claim she vanished one winter night, her body never found, leaving behind only the child who bore the family's mark. The truth was swallowed by the same shadows that had birthed her tragedy, and perhaps that was the final cruelty. Her life erased, her suffering folded neatly back into the silence. But the bloodline did not vanish. It spread, quietly, invisibly, like a stain beneath the floorboards. The children of her child grew, some leaving the village, some staying, their faces carrying echoes of the curse. Outsiders who saw them spoke of something strange in their eyes, a resemblance that felt too close, too inescapable. And in every hushed conversation, every rumor passed down through generations, the daughter's pregnancy became the symbol, the moment when the hidden rot of a family was laid bare for all to see. Her story is not just hers. It is the story of countless women, forgotten and unspoken, whose lives were consumed by the silence of their families and the judgment of their communities. Stories buried in rural America, in houses where windows stay shuttered, in barns that hold secrets darker than dust. For every daughter we know, there are 100 more we don't. Names erased, graves unmarked, lives reduced to nothing more than a warning whispered to frighten children. And so the question remains: was she guilty of carrying a curse, or was she only guilty of surviving it? The village said she was damned. The family said she was silent. But history tells us something different, that silence does not erase truth, it only buries it deeper. And one day, as in her case, the truth forces its way to the surface, screaming in the cries of a newborn that no one wanted to hear. Her pregnancy shocked the village, but the true horror was not the child she carried. It was the cycle that had carried her. A cycle too many still refuse to see, too many still deny, too many still allow to fester in the corners of forgotten towns. Perhaps the daughter is gone, perhaps her child is too, but the bloodline lives on, and so does the silence. And if history has taught us anything, it is this: silence is the most dangerous inheritance of all.